Welcome to Tales of Cold War. This is the true story of how the most powerful military machine on Earth learned the hard way that arrogance is deadlier than any weapon. The bunker, 40 meters beneath the Carpathian Mountains, smelled of damp concrete and stale tobacco, mixed with the acrid bite of electrical equipment running at constant capacity. General Viktor Pavlovich Kulikov stood before the illuminated map table, his thick fingers tracing the defensive perimeter that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, a distance of over 2,000 kilometers of prepared defensive positions, minefields, and interlocking kill zones. Around him, the officers of the Soviet Western Theater Command waited in silence, their faces bathed in the cold blue glow of tactical displays showing the positions of NATO forces across Central Europe. It was late October 1983, and the general was in an excellent mood. Kulikov was 57 years old, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, who had commanded tank battalions in the final drive to Berlin in 1945. He carried the scars of that conflict, both visible and invisible, and he had built his career on the lessons learned in the crucible of the Eastern Front. He had risen through the ranks during the Brezhnev era, a time when the Soviet military had grown to unprecedented size and capability, when the defense budget consumed nearly a quarter of the entire Soviet economy, and when the armored divisions stretched from the Elbe to the Pacific in an unbroken chain of military might. The map before him represented the culmination of decades of strategic planning, billions of rubles in investment, and the collective effort of the Soviet defense establishment. 5 tank armies positioned in East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, ready to execute the largest mechanized offensive in military history if the order ever came from Moscow. This was his domain, and he knew every division, every regiment, every single kilometer of the invasion routes that would carry Soviet armor to the Atlantic Ocean within 14 days. "Show me again," Kulikov said, his voice carrying the gravel of 1,000 battlefield briefings, the weight of command that came from 3 decades of service in the most powerful military organization on Earth. "Show me these American toys they're so proud of." A young intelligence officer stepped forward, a captain whose name was Mikhail Sokolov, recently transferred from the GRU's Technical Analysis Division in Moscow. He fumbled with a stack of glossy photographic prints, satellite reconnaissance images that had been processed at the secret facility outside Kaliningrad and rushed to the command bunker via military courier. The photographs showed sleek white cylinders mounted on what appeared to be standard naval launch tubes aboard American warships operating in the Mediterranean and North Sea. The missiles looked almost delicate, nothing like the massive R-7 intercontinental ballistic missiles that dominated Soviet strategic thinking, nothing like the brutal elegance of the SS-20 Sabre that had been deployed across the Western Soviet Union in the late 1970s. "BGM-109 Tomahawk, Comrade General," Sokolov reported, his voice steady despite the intimidating presence of the senior officers surrounding him. "Land attack cruise missile. Range approximately 1,500 kilometers in current configuration. Guidance system uses terrain contour matching. Designated TERCOM in American technical documentation. The missile carries a W-80 nuclear warhead in strategic variants, or a conventional blast fragmentation warhead of approximately 450 kilograms in the tactical version." "Subsonic," Kulikov interrupted, his eyebrows rising in theatrical disbelief. The question hung in the air like an accusation. They spent how many billions of dollars developing a missile that flies slower than our interceptor aircraft, slower than a MiG-23? The laughter started with Colonel Dmitry Yazov, head of Integrated Air Defense for the Western Military District, a combat veteran who had flown missions over Vietnam as an advisor to the North Vietnamese Air Force. It spread through the assembled staff like ripples on water, a chorus of professional dismissal mixed with genuine amusement. Even the junior officers smiled, though they had the good sense to keep their laughter quiet and respectful. The Americans, it seemed, had once again demonstrated their tendency to over-engineer solutions to problems that didn't exist. The missile achieves Mach 0.7 in cruise flight, Sokolov continued, reading from the intelligence summary that had been prepared by analysts in Moscow who had never set foot in this bunker, who had never felt the weight of operational command. Maximum speed, Mach 0.8 in terminal attack phase. Flight altitude ranges from 100 meters to 50 meters, depending on terrain. Subsonic, Kulikov repeated, savoring the word like a fine wine. He turned to face the assembled staff, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire illuminated map table. Gentlemen, let me educate you about American desperation. NATO knows they cannot match our conventional forces in Central Europe. The numbers do not lie. We have conducted the analysis at every level of command, 5-1. That is the ratio in main battle tanks. For every M1 Abrams or Leopard 2 they can field, we have 5 T-72s or T-80s. For every NATO fighter aircraft operating from bases in West Germany, we have 5 Su-17s or MiG-23s ready to achieve air superiority within the first 48 hours of conflict. For every artillery piece they position along the inter-German border, we have 5 tubes ready to deliver suppressive fire on a scale that would make the bombardment of Berlin look like a training exercise. He jabbed a thick finger at the photographs scattered across the map table. So what do they do when faced with this reality? They build expensive toys and convince their politicians that technology will somehow compensate for the fundamental imbalance in force structure. They pour money into research and development, into guidance systems and miniaturized computers, into weapons that look impressive in congressional hearings, but will shatter like glass against the reality of modern warfare. Kulikov picked up one of the photographs, holding it up to the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead, studying the image with the kind of exaggerated interest that made clear he was performing for his audience. This Tomahawk, do you know what it cannot penetrate? Hardened concrete, reinforced bunkers, the command centers we have constructed across every Warsaw Pact nation, the strategic infrastructure that would allow us to maintain command and control even after NATO's first strike, even after they have expended their tactical nuclear arsenal in a desperate attempt to stop our armored advance. He dropped the photograph bag onto the table with deliberate disdain. The Americans could fire 1,000 of these subsonic firecrackers at our positions, and they would accomplish nothing except to waste their defense budget. A 450-kilogram conventional warhead against bunkers designed to withstand near misses from megaton-yield nuclear weapons. It's a joke. It's the kind of weapon system that exists to make defense contractors wealthy and politicians feel like they're doing something meaningful about the Soviet threat. The bunker filled with the murmur of agreement, the comfortable consensus of men who had spent their careers studying one kind of warfare and who saw no reason to imagine that the fundamental rules had changed. Colonel Yazov leaned forward, his weathered face creased with the confident smile of an expert addressing amateurs. Comrade General, even if we grant the Americans the benefit of doubt regarding their claimed accuracy figures, which I personally consider to be wildly optimistic, our SA-10 surface-to-air missile systems will eliminate these threats long before they reach their intended targets. A subsonic cruise missile is nothing more than an expensive drone, and we shoot down drones in training exercises every month. Exactly, Kulikov said, his voice resonant with satisfaction. Our integrated air defense network extends 300 kilometers into Warsaw Pact territory. Multiple overlapping radar systems, SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, SA-10, and SA-12 missile batteries positioned to create an impenetrable shield. Even if a handful of these Tomahawks manage to evade our fighter patrols, even if they fly low enough to avoid our long-range search radars, they will eventually have to climb to acquire their targets, and that's when our terminal defense systems will destroy them. Subsonic targets are training exercises for our crews, not threats to our strategic infrastructure. Captain Sokolov, the young intelligence officer, shifted his weight uncomfortably. He had read the complete technical analysis from Moscow, including the sections that his superior officers were now dismissing with such confidence. The reports included assessments from defectors, from technical intelligence gathered through signals, intercepts, and satellite photography from agents operating inside American defense contractors. The picture those reports painted was more nuanced and more troubling than the generals wanted to acknowledge. Comrade General, Sokolov ventured carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man walking through a minefield. The technical analysis from GRU headquarters indicates that the terrain-following capability may be more sophisticated than previous American systems. The TERCOM guidance compares radar altimeter readings against stored digital terrain maps, allowing the missile to navigate at extremely low altitude without climbing to acquire targets. Digital terrain maps, Kulikov interrupted, his tone mixing amusement with dismissal. And where do the Americans get these digital terrain maps of Warsaw Pact territory? From satellite photographs, from reconnaissance flights that we track and monitor every hour of every day. Captain, I have read these same intelligence reports, and I have also read the analysis from our own technical experts who explain exactly why this American guidance system will fail under real combat conditions. He ticked off points on his fingers, each one delivered with the certainty of a man who had never been seriously challenged on matters of military doctrine. First, the resolution of satellite photography is insufficient to create the kind of detailed terrain maps that would be required for meter-level navigation accuracy. Second, even if such maps could be created, the digital storage capacity required would exceed what can be practically installed in a missile guidance package. Third, even if both those obstacles could be overcome, weather conditions and seasonal variations would create discrepancies between the stored maps and actual terrain, causing navigation errors that would compound over long flight distances. Fourth, our electronic warfare systems can jam or spoof the radar altimeter signals, causing the missile to crash into terrain or fly high enough to be intercepted by our SAM systems. The assembled officers nodded in agreement. These were sensible objections, grounded in known limitations of technology and the reality of electronic warfare. The Americans were certainly clever, and they had surprised Soviet planners before with innovations like the U-2 spy plane and the Corona reconnaissance satellites. But there were fundamental physical and technical limits that no amount of American ingenuity could overcome. A subsonic cruise missile with a conventional warhead simply could not threaten the kind of hardened, strategic infrastructure that the Soviet Union had been building for 30 years. Kulikov returned to the map table, using a wooden pointer to indicate the scattered blue symbols representing NATO forward positions. Look at this deployment. West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, England. They're positioning these missiles on the periphery of the theater, at maximum distance from our strategic depth. Why? Because they know that any attempt to move launchers closer to the inter-German border would be detected by our reconnaissance assets and targeted for immediate destruction in the opening hours of any conflict. They're trapped in a defensive posture, forced to rely on weapons that can't reach the targets that matter, while we have the operational flexibility to strike anywhere in Western Europe within hours of conflict initiation. He straightened up, his face set in an expression of grim satisfaction. The Americans talk about precision strike capability, about force multipliers and technological superiority, but war is not fought on spreadsheets in Pentagon briefing rooms. War is fought by men in tanks and trenches, by artillery crews and infantry battalions, by the weight of metal and the will to use it. We have both in abundance. NATO has neither, and all the cruise missiles in their inventory won't change that fundamental reality. But 700 kilometers to the west, in a classified facility hidden beneath RAF Lakenheath in England, something was happening that would shatter every assumption that had just been voiced in the comfort of that Carpathian bunker. The first operational ground-launched cruise missiles were being armed with coordinates that Soviet intelligence had categorically assured their generals were either outdated or inaccurate. The missiles were being loaded with digital terrain maps that had been created from satellite imagery so detailed that individual vehicles could be identified in parking lots. And in less than 72 hours, those subsonic toys would begin hitting targets that the Soviet High Command had mathematically proven were beyond the reach of conventional attack. The operations center at RAF Lakenheath was smaller than the Soviet command bunker, less imposing, and equipped with technology that would have seemed almost civilian in its aesthetic. No massive map tables dominating the center of the room. No banks of radio equipment with vacuum tubes glowing in the darkness. Instead, there were computer terminals with cathode ray tube displays, digital plotting tables, and compact communications equipment that represented the cutting edge of early 1980s military technology. Major Robert Havisham, United States Air Force, stood before one of these displays, watching as the mission profile for Operation Silent Strike was loaded into the missile guidance systems. Final targeting data confirmed, said Captain Jennifer Martinez, the mission planning officer who had spent the last 3 months creating the digital terrain files that would guide the Tomahawks to their targets. 16 primary targets, 8 secondary targets, all coordinates verified against latest satellite imagery from National Reconnaissance Office. Flight paths calculated to maximize terrain masking and minimize radar exposure. Havisham studied the display, watching as the computer generated a three-dimensional representation of each missile's flight path. The technology was almost science fiction compared to what had been available just 5 years earlier. The computers that processed the terrain data occupied entire rooms, their magnetic tape drives spinning constantly as they digested thousands of satellite photographs and converted them into the digital elevation models that Tercom guidance required. The cost of creating a single mission profile exceeded the annual budget of some small nations. But the Pentagon had decided that the investment was worth it, because the Tomahawk represented something that had never existed before in conventional warfare: the ability to strike strategic targets deep inside enemy territory with near-surgical precision, without risking pilots or aircraft, and without necessarily triggering nuclear escalation. "What's the Soviet air defense assessment?" Havisham asked. Though he had read the intelligence briefings so many times, he could recite them from memory. "Dense but predictable," Martinez replied, pulling up a new display showing the positions of known Soviet SAM sites. SA-10 batteries are concentrated around major command centers and strategic installations. SA-6 systems provide mobile coverage along likely NATO strike corridors. SA-2 and SA-3 systems fill gaps in the coverage, primarily protecting secondary targets. The issue isn't penetrating the defense network. The issue is that Soviet doctrine assumes threats will arrive from medium to high altitude. Their radar systems are optimized to detect aircraft, not low-flying cruise missiles. And their intelligence assessment of Tomahawk capability? Martinez allowed herself a small smile. GRU technical analysis dismisses the system as ineffective against hardened targets. They assume we're targeting soft infrastructure, logistics hubs, maybe some airfields. They don't believe we can achieve the accuracy necessary to exploit specific vulnerabilities in their bunker designs. Because their analysts are thinking like Soviet engineers, Havisham said quietly. They're thinking about the problem the way they would solve it, with massive warheads and brute force. They're not thinking about targeting ventilation systems and power infrastructure and communication nodes. Exactly. Our satellite imagery shows that every major command bunker in the Western Soviet Union relies on centralized ventilation systems with large air intake and exhaust shafts. The shafts are hardened against blast overpressure from above, but they're not designed to prevent penetration by a weapon that arrives horizontally at high subsonic speed and detonates inside the shaft itself. The explosion gets channeled through the ventilation system, and the overpressure wave propagates through every corridor and room in the bunker. Even bunkers designed to survive nuclear near misses are vulnerable to this kind of precision strike. Havisham nodded slowly. The tactical logic was elegant and brutal. The Soviets had spent billions of rubles building command bunkers that could survive American nuclear weapons. They had never considered that those same bunkers might be vulnerable to conventional weapons delivered with sufficient accuracy. It was a blind spot created by 3 decades of strategic doctrine focused on nuclear warfare, and NATO was about to exploit that blind spot with ruthless efficiency. "Timeline for mission execution?" he asked. "Launch window opens in 68 hours, Martinez said. "Weather forecast is favorable. Cloud cover over the target area will make visual reconnaissance difficult for Soviet forces. Wind patterns are within acceptable parameters for TERCOM navigation. All 16 launch vehicles have completed final systems checks. Missiles are fueled and armed. We're ready to proceed on your authorization. Havisham took a deep breath. This was not an actual combat mission. This was a NATO exercise designed to test the operational capabilities of the ground-launched cruise missile system and demonstrate to Soviet intelligence that their dismissive assessments were dangerously wrong. The targets were not real Soviet command bunkers, but carefully constructed simulations built in remote areas of West Germany, complete with hardened concrete, ventilation systems, and sensor arrays that would record the impact and damage patterns. But the missiles were real. The guidance systems were real. And the message to Moscow would be very real. Your bunkers are not safe. Your assumptions are wrong. And the balance of power has shifted in ways you do not yet understand. Confirm mission authorization with Secure, Havisham said. Make sure everyone up the chain of command understands the strategic implications. Once we launch these missiles and demonstrate that we can hit targets with this precision, there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. The Soviets will have to completely rethink their defensive infrastructure. And that means billions in new construction costs, new air defense systems, new doctrine. We're about to change the game. Martinez nodded and turned to her communications terminal, beginning the process of formal mission authorization. Havisham remained at the display, watching the simulated flight paths trace their way across the digital map of Central Europe. Each line represented hundreds of hours of planning, millions of dollars in technology development, and the collective efforts of engineers, intelligence analysts, and military planners who had believed that precision could be as powerful as mass if applied with sufficient intelligence and care. The radar screen should have been alive with contacts, filled with the usual scatter of commercial air traffic at cruising altitude and the occasional military transport moving between bases in the Western Soviet Union. Instead, it showed nothing unusual, just the familiar pattern of civilian airliners following their scheduled routes and the predictable sweep of NATO surveillance aircraft testing the edges of Soviet airspace. Senior Lieutenant Andrei Kozlov stared at the phosphorescent display, his hand hovering over the alert button that would bring his entire SA-10 battery to full combat readiness. His sight protected the forward command bunker at Kovel, just inside the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, approximately 60 kilometers from the Polish border. The bunker housed the headquarters for the Kiev Military District's Strategic Reserve, including 3 tank divisions that would form the exploitation force for any breakthrough in NATO's defensive line. Inside that bunker were communication systems linking directly to Moscow, nuclear weapons release authority for tactical systems, and the operational plans for an offensive that would carry Soviet armor to the English Channel. By every calculation performed by Soviet strategic analysts, the bunker was absolutely safe from conventional attack. The concrete above Kozlov's head was 6 meters thick, reinforced with a lattice of steel rebar designed by the same engineers who had built the Moscow metro during Stalin's time. The bunker could absorb the shock of anything short of a direct nuclear strike, and NATO lacked the capability to deliver a nuclear weapon with sufficient accuracy to guarantee a direct hit. But something was wrong with the dawn. Kozlov had been on duty since midnight, monitoring the electronic warfare spectrum and coordinating with the air surveillance network that extended across the western military districts. The morning reconnaissance drone from the GRU's Tactical Intelligence Battalion had failed to report its standard position update at 0530. The automatic weather station on the western perimeter, part of the network of sensors that provided data for artillery targeting calculations, had gone silent at 0545, and now, in the pale grey light filtering through the armoured observation slits that gave the radar operators a view of the surrounding countryside, Kozlov thought he heard something. Not the roar of jet engines that would signal incoming NATO strike aircraft, not the whistle of artillery shells. A different sound, a mechanical mosquito whine, rising and falling with the terrain, coming from somewhere in the low clouds that hung over the forests to the west. He reached for the phone to wake the duty officer, a captain who had been sleeping in the crew quarters after 18 hours of monitoring the exercise activities that NATO forces were conducting along the inter-German border. Before Kozlov's fingers touched the receiver, the world became light and noise and the sudden awful certainty that everything General Kulikov had said was wrong. The explosion was not particularly large by military standards. 450 kilograms of high explosive, the kind of payload that a single F-4 Phantom could deliver in a ground attack sortie. But the explosion did not occur on the surface or against the hardened concrete of the bunker's roof. It occurred inside the primary ventilation shaft, 30 meters below ground, in a concrete tube that was never meant to contain a blast wave. The overpressure propagated through the ductwork at the speed of sound, channeled and focused by the confined spaces, turning corners and racing down corridors, seeking every room and chamber in the bunker. Kozlov had time to register the shockwave as it blew out every door in the radar control room. Time to feel the sudden spike in air pressure that ruptured his eardrums and collapsed his lungs. Time for one final thought about how impossible this was supposed to be. And then there was only darkness and silence. Above ground, the guard post at the bunker's main entrance saw the equipment shed that concealed the ventilation system suddenly collapse inward, as if an enormous hand had reached down and crumpled it like paper. A column of dust and smoke rose from the wreckage, backlit by the rising sun, and for a moment there was absolute stillness. Then the sirens began, wailing across the Ukrainian countryside, alerting every military installation within 100 kilometers that something catastrophic had just occurred at a facility that was not supposed to be vulnerable to anything. By 0700, the local KGB security directorate had sealed the entire area, establishing a perimeter that extended 3 kilometers in every direction from the destroyed bunker. By 0800, a helicopter had arrived from Lviv, carrying a damage assessment team composed of military engineers and GRU technical intelligence specialists. And by 0900, a coded message was transmitted via secure military satellite link to the General Staff Building in Moscow. Koval alternate command post destroyed. Casualties unknown, but presumed total. Cause under investigation. Request immediate technical assistance and guidance. In the General Staff Building, a converted Tsarist-era palace that had been modernized with the kind of heavy-handed Soviet efficiency that valued function over form. The message created confusion rather than immediate alarm. Colonel Ivan Petrov, the duty officer for the Western military districts, read the encoded transmission 3 times before he fully processed what it was saying. Koval was supposed to be invulnerable. The bunker had been certified by the Ministry of Defense's Engineering Directorate as capable of withstanding near misses from 20 megaton weapons. The idea that it had been destroyed by something other than a nuclear strike seemed improbable, possibly impossible. An accident seemed more likely. Perhaps one of the underground fuel tanks had exploded, a consequence of poor maintenance or faulty construction. Perhaps there had been a structural failure in the aging concrete, a collapse triggered by the weight of the surrounding earth. Perhaps someone had made a catastrophic error in ammunition handling, setting off sympathetic detonations that had destroyed the entire facility. These explanations were troubling but comprehensible. They fit within the framework of known risks and understood dangers. It took 3 hours for the investigation team to piece together what had actually happened, because no one was initially looking for evidence of a cruise missile strike. The wreckage of the BGM-109's turbojet engine had been scattered by the explosion, mixed with the twisted metal of the ventilation system and the shattered concrete of the bunker's infrastructure. But eventually, a GRU technical specialist named Captain Boris Lebedev found a fragment of the missile's guidance computer casing, a piece of aluminum alloy approximately 20 centimeters square, stamped with an American contractor's serial number and part identification code. Lebedev photographed the fragment from multiple angles, using a Praktika camera loaded with high-speed film that would capture even the smallest details of the manufacturing stamps and assembly markings. He catalogued the fragment's location within the wreckage, measured its orientation, and began the process of forensic analysis that would eventually reconstruct the missile's flight path and impact angle. The fragment was sealed in an evidence bag, tagged with proper chain of custody documentation, and transmitted to Moscow via military courier, along with a revised assessment that transformed confusion into something approaching panic. Attack confirmed. American BGM-109 cruise missile. Penetrated ventilation system via horizontal approach. Bunker destroyed. All personnel presumed dead. Recommend immediate review of all hardened facilities for similar vulnerabilities. Before I tell you what happened next and how this single strike cascaded into a strategic disaster that exposed the fundamental flaws in Soviet defensive doctrine, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? To understand the magnitude of the shock that the Koval strike created in Soviet military planning circles, you have to understand just how completely the defense establishment had committed to the idea that hardened bunkers were invulnerable to conventional attack. This was not simply a matter of engineering confidence. It was a fundamental assumption that shaped every aspect of Soviet strategic planning for a European war. The Soviet Union had invested more than 30 billion rubles, an almost incomprehensible sum, representing roughly 5% of total defense spending across 2 decades, in constructing an interlocking network of hardened command bunkers, communication facilities, ammunition depots, and logistics centers across the Western military districts. These facilities were designed to survive the nuclear exchange that Soviet planners assumed would begin within the first 72 hours of any major conflict with NATO. The theory was straightforward. NATO would use tactical nuclear weapons to attempt to stop Soviet armored offensives, and Moscow would respond with its own tactical nuclear strikes against NATO command and control infrastructure. In that radioactive chaos, the side that could maintain command and control, that could coordinate its forces and adapt to changing circumstances, would have a decisive advantage. Every bunker was built to the same exacting specifications, developed by military engineers who had studied the effects of nuclear weapons at test ranges in Kazakhstan and Novaya Zemlya. Concrete thickness was calculated to withstand the overpressure from a 1 megaton warhead detonating at a distance of 1 kilometer, which translated to roughly 6 meters of reinforced concrete for primary command facilities. The concrete itself was a special formulation, mixed with aggregate that had been selected for its compression resistance and ability to absorb shock waves. Steel reinforcement bars, each one manufactured to precise specifications at dedicated military foundries, were woven into a 3-dimensional lattice that could flex slightly under stress without shattering. The bunkers were buried deep, typically 30 to 50 meters below the surface, with the excavated earth mounded above them to create additional shock absorption. Entrance tunnels were designed with blast doors that could seal in milliseconds, protecting the interior from both overpressure and the intense thermal pulse that preceded a nuclear shockwave. Ventilation systems drew air through multiple filtration stages that could remove radioactive particles, chemical weapons, and biological contaminants. Power came from multiple redundant diesel generators with fuel supplies sufficient for 3 months of continuous operation. Communication systems were hardened against electromagnetic pulse and could maintain contact with Moscow even if every surface installation had been vaporized. These were not simple bunkers. They were underground fortresses designed by some of the most talented engineers in the Soviet Union and built at enormous expense by specialized construction battalions that had been trained specifically for this purpose. The engineers had anticipated every conceivable threat: nuclear blast overpressure, thermal radiation, electromagnetic pulse, seismic shock from near misses, penetrating radiation, chemical contamination, biological weapons. The list of threats that had been analyzed and defended against filled volumes of technical documentation. But nowhere in those volumes was there serious consideration of precision conventional strikes targeting specific vulnerabilities in the bunker designs. The idea simply had not occurred to anyone because it required capabilities that Soviet intelligence had assessed NATO did not and could not possess. Precision strike meant accuracy measured in meters, not kilometers. It meant navigation systems that could guide a weapon through hundreds of kilometers of flight and still hit a target the size of a ventilation shaft. It meant intelligence, detailed enough to identify those specific vulnerabilities from satellite reconnaissance. It meant a complete rethinking of how conventional weapons could be employed against strategic infrastructure. The Americans had done that rethinking, and they had done it quietly, without the grand announcements and propaganda campaigns that characterized Soviet weapons development. The Tomahawk program had been in development since the mid-1970s, evolving from a simple cruise missile concept into a sophisticated precision strike weapon. The key breakthrough had been TERCOM, terrain contour matching, a guidance technology that seemed almost magical to Soviet analysts who were accustomed to inertial navigation systems that accumulated error over distance. Turcom worked by continuously comparing the terrain beneath the missile with a stored digital map. A radar altimeter measured the distance to the ground dozens of times per second. A computer compared those measurements to the expected terrain profile for the missile's current position. If the measurements matched the expected profile, the missile was on course. If they didn't match, the computer calculated a correction and adjusted the missile's flight path. The process repeated continuously throughout the flight, compensating for wind drift, navigation errors, and the inevitable imperfections in inertial guidance. The sophistication was in the details. The digital terrain maps had to be created from satellite imagery with meter-level resolution, which required the advanced photo reconnaissance satellites that the United States had been launching since the late 1960s. The altimeter had to be accurate enough to detect variations in terrain height measured in single meters, which required radar technology that the Soviets had assumed would be too large and too power-hungry to fit in a cruise missile. The computer had to process all this data in real time while consuming minimal electrical power and occupying minimal space inside the missile body, which required microprocessor technology that was years ahead of anything Soviet defense contractors could produce. The Americans had solved all these problems. They had miniaturized computers to the point where a guidance package that would have filled a room in 1960 could now fit inside a package the size of a briefcase. They had developed radar altimeters that used advanced signal processing to extract terrain information from ground clutter. They had created satellite reconnaissance systems that could photograph Soviet installations with such detail that analysts could identify vehicle types in parking lots and count the windows on buildings. And they had integrated all these capabilities into a weapon system that cost roughly $2 million per missile. Expensive, but not prohibitively so, for an economy that dwarfed the Soviet Union in total productive capacity. General Kulikov and his staff had known about the Tomahawk program for years. Soviet intelligence had obtained technical documentation, probably through espionage, certainly through signals intercepts and analysis of American defense budget documents. The GRU had compiled detailed assessments of the missile's capabilities, complete with specifications that were remarkably accurate. Range, speed, warhead size, guidance principles, all of it had been known and analyzed. But knowledge is not the same as understanding. The Soviet analysts had looked at the specifications and concluded that the Tomahawk could not threaten hardened infrastructure. They had performed calculations based on the warhead size and the concrete thickness of their bunkers, and the mathematics had been clear. Insufficient kinetic energy, an explosive force to penetrate 6 meters of reinforced concrete. The calculations were correct. The conclusion was wrong, because the analysts had never imagined that the Americans would target vulnerabilities rather than trying to overwhelm defenses through brute force. This was a fundamental difference in military philosophy that neither side fully appreciated until the moment when American missiles started hitting Soviet targets with devastating precision. Soviet military doctrine, shaped by the experience of the Great Patriotic War, emphasized mass and momentum. When faced with a fortified position, the solution was to concentrate overwhelming artillery fire to saturate the target area with high explosive until no fortification could survive. German bunkers had fallen to Soviet artillery in 1944 and 45, not because individual shells were particularly accurate, but because hundreds or thousands of shells falling on the same area would eventually find every weakness and exploit every vulnerability through sheer statistical probability. American military doctrine, shaped by different experiences and different technological capabilities, emphasized precision over mass. Why fire 1,000 shells when one shell, properly targeted, could accomplish the same result? Why risk pilots and aircraft in mass bombing raids when a cruise missile could strike the same target without risking any lives? This was the philosophy that had produced the Tomahawk, and it was about to demonstrate its effectiveness in the most dramatic way possible. The strike on Kovel was not an isolated incident. It was the first target in a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to demonstrate to Soviet intelligence that NATO could reach deep into Warsaw Pact territory and strike facilities that had been considered invulnerable. The missiles had been launched from multiple sites across Western Europe, timed to arrive at their targets in rapid succession, creating the kind of cascading disaster that would overwhelm Soviet damage assessment capabilities and create maximum psychological impact. At 1300 hours, 3 hours after the Kovel strike, 3 more bunkers reported catastrophic hits. The command post at Brest, protecting the junction point where Soviet, Belarusian, and Polish forces would coordinate during any offensive into Central Europe, was struck by a missile that had flown the entire width of East Germany at an altitude between 50 and 100 meters. The missile had used the terrain of the North German plain to mask its approach, flying so low that it had appeared on radar only as occasional ground clutter that operators had dismissed as birds or weather phenomena. The Tomahawk had navigated through the Harz Mountains, a region of dense forests and steep valleys that provided natural concealment from radar, emerged over the Polish flatlands, and struck its target's ventilation system with the same surgical precision as the Kovel attack. The result was identical: catastrophic overpressure damage throughout the bunker, total loss of command and control capability, complete destruction of the facility that had been hardened to survive nuclear war. The ammunition depot at Rivne, supposedly hidden beneath a forested hillside in western Ukraine and camouflaged so effectively that American satellite reconnaissance had supposedly never detected its true nature, took 2 missiles in rapid succession. The first Tomahawk struck the surface camouflage installation, a structure designed to look like an agricultural collective's grain storage facility, but which actually concealed the reinforced entrance to the underground depot. The explosion destroyed the camouflage and exposed the armored entrance doors to direct observation. The second missile, arriving 90 seconds later, penetrated through the damaged entrance and detonated inside the main storage gallery. The secondary explosions were visible from satellite orbit. 3 months' worth of artillery ammunition, carefully stockpiled for the opening phase of any major offensive, detonated in a chain reaction that transformed the entire hillside into a crater 300 meters in diameter. The fireball rose nearly 1,000 meters into the air, creating a mushroom cloud that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to a small nuclear detonation. Soviet air defense forces in the region went to full alert, convinced for several terrifying minutes that NATO had initiated a nuclear first strike. Only after frantic communications with Moscow and confirmation that no nuclear detonations had been detected by early warning systems did the alert level decrease to conventional attack status. The communication center at Lutsk, hardened against nuclear electromagnetic pulse and buried beneath a mountain in the Carpathian range, was hit by a missile that had used the mountain itself as cover for its final approach. The Tomahawk had skimmed the peak, descended the far slope using terrain-following mode to maintain minimum altitude, and struck the facility's above-ground power transformer station. The transformer station had been hardened against blast effects, but the engineers had never imagined that a weapon would arrive at such a precise angle and with such specific targeting. The explosion severed the primary power supply and triggered safety interlocks that shut down the backup diesel generators. Without power, the communication center's systems failed, and with them, the ability to coordinate air defense across the entire Western military district. By 1500 hours, 9 strategic installations had been destroyed or severely damaged. None of them should have been vulnerable. None of them had been adequately defended because Soviet doctrine had assumed that they did not need defending against conventional weapons. And in every case, the weapon was the same, that subsonic, supposedly harmless cruise missile that General Kulikov had dismissed with such confident laughter just weeks earlier. The emergency session of the Defense Council began at 2200 hours in a deep bunker beneath the Kremlin, one of the few command facilities in the Soviet Union that had been hastily retrofitted with blast doors on its ventilation systems in the hours since the magnitude of the NATO demonstration had become clear. General Kulikov was not present. He had been summoned to provide a personal briefing to the Minister of Defense and the General Secretary, and had not returned. Rumors circulated among the staff officers about shouting matches in the minister's office, about Kulikov's confident assessments being thrown in his face, about career-ending consequences for the intelligence failure that had left Soviet strategic infrastructure vulnerable to American precision strikes. Marshal Nikolai Olgakov, Chief of the General Staff and the most professionally competent military officer in the Soviet command structure, stood before a map table that looked eerily similar to the one in the Carpathian bunker where Kulikov had given his dismissive assessment. But the atmosphere in this bunker was very different. There was no laughter, no confident dismissals, only the grim acknowledgement that fundamental assumptions had been proven wrong and that the consequences would reshape Soviet military planning for the foreseeable future. "Gentlemen," Olgakov said, his voice carrying none of the theatrical confidence that had characterized Kulikov's briefings, "we have a problem that goes far beyond the immediate damage to our infrastructure. The Americans have demonstrated a capability that we assessed they did not possess. More importantly, they have demonstrated it in a manner specifically designed to maximize the psychological and strategic impact. They have told us, in the clearest possible terms, that our bunkers are not safe, that our command and control infrastructure is vulnerable, and that our strategic planning assumptions are obsolete." The intelligence staff laid out the details over the next 2 hours, and the picture that emerged was profoundly disturbing. First, the missiles had achieved navigation accuracy that exceeded Soviet estimates by an order of magnitude. The average missed distance for the 9 strikes was calculated at 8.4 meters from the intended aim points. This was precision that Soviet analysts had assumed would require human pilots or terminal guidance systems that would make the weapons prohibitively expensive. The Americans had achieved it with automated systems that required no human input after launch. Second, the missiles had demonstrated an ability to exploit specific vulnerabilities in bunker designs that Soviet engineers had never considered as credible threats. Ventilation systems, power infrastructure, communication links, all the support systems that made the bunkers functional had proven to be accessible to precision strikes in ways that would require fundamental redesigns to counter. The bunkers themselves, the 6 meters of reinforced concrete, remained intact in most cases, but a bunker without ventilation, without power, without communications, was just an expensive tomb. Third, and perhaps most troubling, NATO appeared to have detailed intelligence about the locations and designs of Soviet strategic facilities that had been classified at the highest levels. Satellite reconnaissance was part of the explanation, but not all of it. The precision with which the missiles had struck ventilation shafts and power stations suggested that NATO had obtained construction plans or detailed technical intelligence about the bunker designs. This implied either a major counterintelligence failure, successful espionage operations that had penetrated the Soviet defense establishment, or satellite reconnaissance capabilities that were even more advanced than Soviet intelligence had assessed. The strategic implications rippled outward like shockwaves from a detonation. If NATO could strike command bunkers that were supposed to be invulnerable, then the entire Soviet strategy for a European war was compromised. The deep operations doctrine, the plan to drive armored columns to the Atlantic Ocean in 2 weeks, depended absolutely on maintaining command and control across multiple fronts. Tank divisions needed coordination. Artillery needed targeting information. Logistics needed routing and scheduling. All of this required a functioning command infrastructure. Soviet war planners had assumed that this infrastructure would survive NATO's conventional attacks and would remain functional until the nuclear exchange that everyone assumed would begin within the first 72 hours of major combat. Now, suddenly, that assumption was invalid. NATO could strike command bunkers without using nuclear weapons, which meant they could disrupt Soviet operations without triggering the nuclear escalation that would lead to mutual annihilation. This created a strategic space for conventional conflict that Soviet doctrine had assumed did not exist. The Americans had found a way to fight a European war without immediately resorting to tactical nuclear weapons. They had found a way to threaten Soviet strategic depth using conventional means. And they had demonstrated these capabilities in an exercise designed specifically to send a message to Moscow. We can reach you, we can hurt you, and we can do it without crossing the nuclear threshold. Marshal Ogarkov summarized the new reality with his characteristic directness. We have spent 30 years building a conventional military machine on the assumption that NATO could not threaten our strategic infrastructure without using nuclear weapons. That assumption is no longer valid. We must adapt, and we must adapt quickly, because the Americans have just revealed capabilities that fundamentally change the calculus of deterrence and conflict in Central Europe. The adaptation began that night, but it would take years to complete and would ultimately contribute to the economic pressures that helped bring down the Soviet Union. Air defense networks had to be redesigned to detect low-altitude cruise missiles. New radar systems had to be developed that could distinguish small, slow-moving targets from ground clutter. Command bunkers had to be retrofitted with blast doors on ventilation systems and hardened power supplies. Redundant communication networks had to be established so that the loss of a single facility would not create catastrophic degradation of command capability. All of this required money, and money was something that the Soviet economy could barely provide even before this new round of defense spending. The 1980s were already a time of economic strain, as declining oil prices and the costs of the war in Afghanistan put pressure on the budget. Adding billions of rubles in new defense requirements meant either cutting spending in other areas or accepting even larger budget deficits. Neither option was appealing, but both would become necessary as the strategic competition with NATO intensified. But there was a more immediate consequence, one that played out in the careers and reputations of the men who had assured their political masters that NATO's cruise missiles were harmless toys. General Kulikov was relieved of command within a week of the NATO exercise. The official announcement, published in Red Star newspaper, stated that he was being reassigned to a training position in the Far Eastern Military District due to routine rotation of senior officers. The unofficial reality known to everyone in the Soviet military establishment was exile and professional disgrace. Kulikov had been wrong about a fundamental strategic question, and his confident dismissal of the cruise missile threat had contributed to the vulnerability that NATO had so dramatically exposed. He was sent as far from the European theatre as it was possible to send him without actually dismissing him from service, assigned to oversee training exercises in Siberia, where his mistakes would have minimal strategic consequence. Colonel Yazov, who had assured Kulikov that SA-10 surface-to-air missile systems would easily intercept subsonic cruise missiles, was demoted to lieutenant colonel and transferred to an air defense battalion in Kamchatka. His technical assessments of the interception problem had been correct in the abstract, but they had failed to account for the tactical reality of low-altitude penetration and terrain masking. The SA-10 system was perfectly capable of shooting down cruise missiles, but only if the radar could detect them early enough to generate a firing solution. And the Tomahawk's flight profile had been specifically designed to minimize radar exposure until it was too late for intercept. Captain Sokolov, the young intelligence officer who had tried to brief Kulikov on the Tomahawk's capabilities and who had been dismissed with such contempt, was quietly promoted to major and transferred to the GRU's Technical Analysis Division in Moscow. His warnings about terrain following capability and precision guidance had been ignored, but the permanent record showed that he had tried to sound the alarm. In the Soviet system, being right when your superiors were wrong was not always rewarded, but in this case, the magnitude of the failure was so great that someone had to be seen as having raised concerns, and Sokolov filled that role perfectly. But the real casualties were not individuals. They were assumptions. The assumption that mass would always triumph over precision. The assumption that hardened bunkers were invulnerable to conventional attack. The assumption that NATO's technological edge was a sign of weakness rather than a different and potentially superior approach to modern warfare. These assumptions had shaped Soviet military doctrine for decades, and now they were being questioned at the highest levels of the defense establishment. Soviet military doctrine in the 1980s was built on lessons learned in the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany. Concentrate overwhelming force at the point of decision. Maintain momentum. Accept heavy casualties in exchange for strategic gains. Use mass artillery to pulverize defensive positions. These were doctrines that had worked brilliantly against German forces from 1943 to 1945, driving them back from Stalingrad to Berlin in a campaign of unprecedented scale and violence. But those doctrines were fundamentally unsuited to an era where a single precision-guided missile could be more strategically significant than an entire artillery battalion. The Tomahawk had not destroyed more facilities than a sustained artillery barrage could have eliminated, but it had destroyed them with far greater efficiency, with zero risk to NATO personnel, and with a demonstration of capability that had profound psychological impact. The Americans had shown that they could reach deep into Soviet territory, identify specific vulnerabilities, and strike with surgical precision, all without the massive logistical footprint that traditional military operations required. The strikes of October 1983 were not part of any actual war. They were a NATO exercise, a demonstration designed to test capabilities and send a message to Moscow about technological superiority and strategic reach. But the exercise used real missiles against real targets, simulated Soviet command facilities that had been constructed in remote areas of West Germany specifically for this purpose. The targeting data was real, derived from actual satellite reconnaissance of genuine Soviet bunkers. The flight profiles were real, tested and refined through years of development. Everything except the final impact was designed to replicate what would happen in actual combat. Soviet reconnaissance satellites had photographed the entire exercise, watching as NATO launched 16 cruise missiles from dispersed sites across Western Europe. Tracking stations had monitored the missiles' flight paths, noting with growing alarm how effectively they used terrain to avoid radar detection. Analysis teams had examined the wreckage of the simulated bunkers, calculating the precise impact points and assessing the damage patterns. And the conclusion was inescapable. If NATO could hit Mach targets in Germany with meter-level accuracy, they could hit real targets in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia with equal precision. The strategic consequences rippled outward for years. The Soviet Union accelerated its own cruise missile programs, attempting to match American capabilities in precision guidance and terrain-following flight. But the technology gap proved difficult to close, not because Soviet engineers lacked skill, but because they lacked the supporting infrastructure of advanced computers, satellite mapping, and precision manufacturing that American defense contractors could draw upon. Soviet cruise missiles remained larger, less accurate, and more expensive than their NATO counterparts, a testament to the systemic advantages of the Western technological base. More broadly, the Tomahawk strikes demonstrated that the strategic competition of the Cold War was not simply about who could build more tanks or deploy more missiles. It was about who could innovate faster, who could integrate new technologies more effectively, and who could adapt doctrine to exploit those technologies. In that competition, the Soviet Union's centrally planned economy was at a fundamental disadvantage. American defense contractors competed with each other to produce better systems. Soviet defense plants operated under state direction, with less incentive for innovation and less ability to draw on advances in civilian technology. The economic costs of responding to the cruise missile threat compounded over time. Each new generation of American precision weapons required a Soviet response, and each response required investment in new air defense systems, new bunker designs, new communication networks. The cumulative effect was a defense budget that consumed an ever larger share of Soviet GDP, crowding out investment in civilian infrastructure and economic modernization. By the mid-1980s, defense spending was approaching 30% of the Soviet economy, a burden that no nation could sustain indefinitely without either collapsing or fundamentally reforming its economic system. Mikhail Gorbachev would choose reform when he came to power in 1985, but by then the damage was done. The Soviet Union could not afford to compete across every dimension of military capability simultaneously, and the choice to prioritize some areas meant accepting vulnerability in others. The cruise missile threat forced investment in air defense and bunker hardening at the expense of naval modernization and strategic nuclear forces. Every ruble spent on countering NATO's precision weapons was a ruble not spent on maintaining the submarine fleet or upgrading intercontinental ballistic missiles. These trade-offs were inevitable, given the Soviet Union's smaller economy and lower technological base, but they were made more painful by the realization that American innovation was not slowing down. The Tomahawk was just the first generation of precision weapons. Stealth aircraft would follow, then satellite-guided bombs, then unmanned aerial vehicles, each new system presenting new challenges for Soviet defenses and requiring new investments to counter. The technological race was becoming unsustainable, and Soviet military planners knew it, even if they could not publicly acknowledge the fact. But in October 1983, those long-term consequences were not yet visible. What was visible was immediate and personal. A group of Soviet generals who had laughed at American toys were now scrambling to explain to their political masters why those toys had just rendered billions of rubles worth of fortifications obsolete. General Kulikov, sitting in his new office in Vladivostok overlooking the Pacific Ocean, had plenty of time to reflect on how badly he had misjudged the threat and how expensive his confidence had proven to be. The propaganda response was predictable and immediate. Soviet media said nothing about the NATO exercise or the successful demonstration of cruise missile capabilities. The few leaks that reached Western journalists through diplomatic channels were dismissed as propaganda exaggerations designed to justify increased NATO defense budgets. Officially, the Soviet position remained that their defenses were impenetrable, that their strategic infrastructure was secure, and that American cruise missiles posed no significant threat to Warsaw Pact military capabilities. But within the classified briefing rooms of the General Staff, the tone was very different. The Americans had called a bluff that Soviet planners had not even realized they were making. For 30 years, the defense establishment had assumed that hardened bunkers were invulnerable to conventional attack, and that assumption had shaped every aspect of war planning. Now that assumption had been revealed as dangerously wrong, and the consequences had to be confronted honestly, at least in internal discussions, where political considerations did not override strategic reality. The technological race that followed transformed Cold War military planning on both sides. NATO doubled down on precision strike capabilities, developing new generations of cruise missiles with even longer ranges and greater accuracy. The Tomahawk was upgraded with improved guidance systems, more powerful warheads, and extended range that would eventually reach 2,500 kilometers. New variants were developed for different missions: anti-ship strikes, bunker penetration, runway cratering, each one optimized for a specific target set. The Soviets invested heavily in air defense systems designed to counter low-altitude threats, developing new radar technologies that could detect small targets against ground clutter. The SA-12 system, introduced in the late 1980s, represented a generational leap in capability compared to earlier systems. It could engage cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, and aircraft simultaneously, and its radar could track targets flying at altitudes below 50 meters. But the SA-12 was expensive and complex, requiring years of development and substantial investment in supporting infrastructure. More fundamentally, the cruise missile threat forced a rethinking of bunker design throughout the Soviet military establishment. Every major command facility, built or renovated after 1983, incorporated blast doors on ventilation systems, redundant power supplies with hardened transformers, and dispersed communication links that could maintain functionality even if the primary bunker was destroyed. The cost mounted steadily. A command bunker that would have cost 50 million rubles to construct in 1980 now cost 150 million rubles in 1985, with the increase driven entirely by the need to defend against precision strikes. The psychological impact was harder to quantify, but no less significant. For 3 decades, Soviet military culture had been built on confidence in numerical superiority and the belief that mass would ultimately prevail over technology. The tank armies, the artillery regiments, the endless divisions waiting behind the Iron Curtain. These were tangible expressions of power that could be photographed, counted, and used to intimidate potential adversaries. But precision weapons like the Tomahawk introduced uncertainty into the strategic calculus. A smaller force, properly equipped and intelligently employed, could now threaten targets that numerical superiority could not protect. This uncertainty affected Soviet war planning in subtle but important ways. Operational plans that had assumed command bunkers would remain functional throughout a conventional conflict had to be revised to account for the possibility of losing command facilities early in any engagement. Logistics networks that had relied on centralized coordination had to be redesigned with redundancy and dispersion in mind, creating multiple fallback positions and alternative command posts that could maintain operations if primary facilities were struck. Training programs had to teach officers to operate with degraded communications and to make decisions without constant guidance from higher headquarters. This was a significant cultural shift for a military organization that emphasized centralized control and rigid adherence to operational plans. Soviet doctrine had always stressed the importance of coordinated operations across multiple fronts, with detailed planning and careful synchronization. Teaching commanders to improvise and adapt when the command structure was disrupted went against decades of institutional culture and required fundamental changes in how officers were educated and evaluated. These were not trivial adjustments. They represented a fundamental rethinking of how the Soviet military would fight a modern war, forced upon them by NATO's demonstration of capabilities that Soviet intelligence had dismissed as impractical or ineffective. And this rethinking was happening not because of some brilliant Soviet innovation or strategic insight, but because NATO had demonstrated that the old assumptions were dangerously, catastrophically wrong. The irony was not lost on Western analysts who studied the Soviet response to the cruise missile threat. The Soviet Union had spent the 1970s modernizing its conventional forces, building what appeared to be an unstoppable military machine capable of overwhelming NATO through sheer mass and momentum. But that very investment in traditional military power had created vulnerabilities that precision weapons could exploit. The command infrastructure necessary to coordinate hundreds of divisions was also a potential single point of failure if NATO could strike it effectively. The logistics network required to sustain a rapid offensive was vulnerable to disruption if key nodes could be identified and destroyed. The confidence in numerical superiority had bred complacency about defending strategic infrastructure against threats that seemed too small to matter. The Americans had not tried to outbuild the Soviets. They had outthought them, identifying the weak points in Soviet doctrine and developing weapons specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses. This was asymmetric warfare at the strategic level, using technological advantages to compensate for numerical disadvantages and creating capabilities that transformed the entire strategic equation. General Kulikov, in his exile in the Far Eastern military district, had plenty of time to reflect on how profoundly he had misjudged the threat. His error had not been simply one of intelligence analysis or technical assessment. It had been a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that warfare could be fundamentally different from the battles he had studied and the exercises he had conducted throughout his career. He had looked at the Tomahawk and seen a subsonic missile with a conventional warhead, and he had concluded, based on straightforward engineering calculations, that it could not threaten bunkers designed to survive nuclear blasts. What he had failed to grasp was that the Tomahawk did not need to destroy bunkers through sheer explosive force. It needed only to exploit their vulnerabilities with sufficient precision to render them useless. It was a different paradigm of warfare, one where surgical strikes replaced massive bombardments, where intelligence about specific weaknesses mattered more than raw destructive power, and where a careful understanding of the enemy's infrastructure could be more valuable than overwhelming firepower. This was the lesson that Soviet military analysts would spend the remainder of the Cold War trying to absorb and counter. The cruise missile had not won a war. It had not destroyed the Soviet military machine, but it had revealed a fundamental weakness in that machine's design, and in doing so, it had changed the strategic balance in ways that consistently favored NATO's technological advantages over Soviet numerical superiority. The memory of those October strikes influenced every subsequent arms control negotiation. When Soviet and American diplomats sat down to discuss limits on intermediate-range nuclear forces, the Tomahawk was always part of the calculation. Soviet negotiators understood that the cruise missile's value was not primarily in its ability to deliver nuclear warheads, but in its demonstrated effectiveness as a precision conventional weapon. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in December 1987, eliminated an entire class of ground-launched missiles, including the GLCMs that had proven so devastating in the NATO exercise. But the treaty did nothing to limit sea-launched or air-launched cruise missiles, which meant that NATO retained significant precision strike capability even after the ground-launched systems were withdrawn. Soviet negotiators accepted this asymmetry because they had learned to respect what cruise missiles could do, and because they calculated that eliminating the ground launch threat was worth the trade-off of allowing naval and air-launched variants to continue. It was a pragmatic decision driven by the realization that trying to match NATO's precision strike capabilities across all launch platforms would be prohibitively expensive and technically challenging. Better to negotiate limits where possible and focus defensive investments on countering the threats that remained. By the time the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, cruise missiles had become a standard component of modern military arsenals around the world. The technology that Soviet generals had dismissed as a toy in 1983 had proliferated to dozens of countries and had fundamentally changed how militaries thought about power projection and strategic strike. The Gulf War of 1991 showcased American cruise missile capabilities to a global audience as hundreds of Tomahawks struck targets across Iraq with the same surgical precision that had destroyed Mach bunkers in Germany 8 years earlier. The images of cruise missiles flying through the streets of Baghdad, broadcast live on CNN, demonstrated to the world what NATO had demonstrated to the Soviet Union in that October exercise. Precision was power, and accuracy was as important as explosive yield. The strategic lessons of the Tomahawk story endure in military planning to this day. Technological superiority matters, but only if it is applied intelligently and if commanders have the humility to question their assumptions. Arrogance is a vulnerability that can be exploited by adversaries who see clearly and plan carefully. The side that adapts faster and integrates new capabilities more effectively will have advantages that transcend raw numbers and traditional measures of military power. General Kulikov died in Moscow in 1993. His reputation never fully recovered from the disaster of October 1983. In his memoirs, published posthumously by a small military press, he devoted exactly 3 brief paragraphs to the cruise missile incident, describing it as an unfortunate intelligence miscalculation based on incomplete technical data. He did not mention his confident laughter in the Carpathian bunker or his dismissive assertions that American precision weapons could never threaten Soviet strategic infrastructure. Perhaps he had genuinely forgotten those moments in the years that followed. Or perhaps he had simply chosen to remember history in a way that was less painful to his professional legacy. Major Sokolov, the intelligence officer who had tried to warn Kulikov and who had been rewarded with promotion and a position where his analytical skills would be properly utilized, rose to the rank of lieutenant general before retiring in the late 1990s. In occasional interviews with military historians studying the final years of the Cold War, he was always diplomatic about the 1983 incident, never directly criticizing his former commanders, but making his message clear through careful choice of words and strategic emphasis. Listen to the evidence even when it contradicts your expectations. Question your assumptions, especially when they seem most secure. Never underestimate an adversary's capacity for innovation or their ability to find asymmetric solutions to strategic problems. The bunker at Koval was eventually rebuilt, incorporating every lesson that had been learned from its destruction. The new design included blast doors on all ventilation shafts, multiple redundant power supplies with hardened transformer stations located hundreds of meters from the main bunker, and dispersed communication antennas that could maintain functionality, even if the primary facility was destroyed. The engineers who designed the rebuild knew what their predecessors had not. Precision could defeat protection, accuracy could overcome armor, and a subsonic missile with a conventional warhead could, under the right circumstances, be more strategically significant than a hypersonic weapon with a nuclear payload. The ruins of the original bunker, buried under tons of collapsed concrete and twisted steel rebar, remained as they fell, a classified memorial to the day when Soviet confidence collided with American innovation and lost. The site is visited occasionally by military historians and intelligence analysts studying the evolution of precision weapons and the vulnerabilities of hardened infrastructure. They come to photograph the wreckage, to examine the blast patterns, to understand through direct observation how a weapon that was dismissed as inadequate accomplished something that Soviet engineers had declared impossible. The Tomahawk missile that struck Koval on that October morning in 1983 was serial number TM-2847. According to reconstruction of the guidance system, fragments recovered from the wreckage. It was one of the first production models to carry a live warhead in a NATO exercise, manufactured at the Hughes Aircraft Facility in Tucson, Arizona, and delivered to European forces in the summer of 1983. Its flight time from launch to impact was 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 33 seconds. Its navigation accuracy was later calculated at 7.3 meters from the designated aim point, a precision that exceeded the design specifications and demonstrated the maturity of the TERCOM guidance technology. The missile's guidance computer had made over 12,000 course corrections during its flight, adjusting for wind conditions, terrain variations, and the inevitable drift of its inertial navigation system. Each correction calculated and executed automatically without any human input. 7.3 meters. In the vast scale of strategic warfare, where success is usually measured in kilometers and victory is counted in divisions destroyed and territory conquered, 7.3 meters might seem insignificant, barely worth mentioning in operational reports. But that precision, applied to the vulnerable point of a supposedly invulnerable bunker, had been enough to destroy a major command facility and shatter a generation of confident assumptions about the nature of modern warfare. This is the enduring lesson of the Tomahawk story, the strategic truth that emerged from the wreckage of Soviet bunkers and the ruin of military careers built on false assumptions. Technological superiority is nothing without the wisdom to use it effectively. But arrogance is everything when it blinds you to the possibility that someone else has found a better way to fight. The Soviet generals who mocked NATO's toys learned this lesson the hard way, watching from their supposedly safe bunkers as their assumptions exploded along with the targets they had sworn were mathematically impossible to strike. In war, as in life, it is not always the largest weapon or the most massive army that determines victory. It is the ability to see clearly what others miss, to adapt quickly when circumstances change, and to respect your opponent's capacity to surprise you with innovations that seem impossible until they succeed. General Kulikov had commanded 5 tank armies and had all the resources of the Soviet military machine at his disposal. But he lacked the humility to imagine that a smaller force, armed with precision rather than mass, could threaten the infrastructure he had sworn to protect. The Tomahawk demonstrated that precision is a force multiplier, that accuracy is a form of power as potent as explosive yield, and that the future of warfare belongs to those who can see targets clearly and strike them precisely, not merely to those who can build bigger weapons and thicker armor. This was the revolution that Soviet generals failed to anticipate, and the lesson they learned too late to salvage their reputations or their strategic doctrine. The Cold War produced countless weapon systems, from intercontinental ballistic missiles that could destroy entire cities to stealth bombers invisible to radar, each one representing a different approach to the eternal problem of projecting power and deterring aggression. But few weapons had the psychological and strategic impact of the Tomahawk cruise missile, precisely because it succeeded by being systematically underestimated by every level of the Soviet military establishment. It was the weapon that generals laughed at in classified briefings, right up until the moment it proved them catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. That laughter, echoing through the bunker beneath the Carpathian Mountains in those confident days of October 1983, represents everything that is dangerous about military confidence untethered from rigorous analysis and intellectual humility. Kulikov laughed because the numbers seemed to favor Soviet forces overwhelmingly. He laughed because Soviet doctrine said bunkers were safe from conventional attack. He laughed because his imagination failed him at the critical moment when he needed to conceive of a different kind of threat, one that exploited vulnerabilities rather than trying to overcome defenses through brute force. And somewhere in Western Europe, in the classified planning centers where American strategists worked late into the night, developing targeting packages and flight profiles, there was no laughter. There was only focused professional work, the quiet determination of engineers and analysts and military planners who understood that innovation could be as powerful as mass if applied with sufficient intelligence and care. They loaded coordinates into guidance computers with meter-level precision. They launched missiles that flew low and slow and quiet, using terrain to hide and digital maps to navigate. And they let the results speak for themselves with devastating clarity. The targets the Soviet generals swore were safe burned or crumbled or went dark, one after another through that October day, until the laughter died and the lesson was learned, and the careers ended and the strategic balance shifted in ways that would echo through the final years of the Cold War. This is the story of how the mighty fell, not because they lacked strength or courage or resources, but because they lacked the humility to question their own assumptions and the wisdom to imagine that warfare could be different than they expected. It is the story of October 1983, when precision defeated protection and arrogance met its match in the cold mathematics of meter-level accuracy. It is the story of how a weapon dismissed as a toy became a revolution in military capabilities, and it is a warning that endures to this day for every military commander, every strategic planner, every national security establishment that has ever been tempted to laugh at an opponent's innovation simply because it doesn't fit familiar patterns or meet conventional expectations. Never mock the toy. It might just be smarter, more capable, and more dangerous than your assumptions allow you to imagine. And by the time you learn otherwise, by the time the targets you swore were safe begin to explode with surgical precision, it will be too late to salvage anything except the bitter lesson that should have been learned before the first missile ever flew. The Tomahawk's legacy extends far beyond that October demonstration. It fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of warfare, proving that precision could be as decisive as mass, that accuracy could compensate for smaller numbers, and that careful intelligence combined with technological innovation could create capabilities that transformed military planning at every level. The weapon that Soviet generals dismissed became the template for modern precision strike warfare, inspiring generations of cruise missiles, guided bombs, and unmanned aerial vehicles that would dominate conflicts from the Persian Gulf to the Balkans to Afghanistan. But perhaps the most important legacy was not technological, but philosophical. The Tomahawk demonstrated that assumptions must be constantly tested, that confidence without verification is a recipe for disaster, and that the enemy you underestimate is the one who will find your weaknesses and exploit them with devastating effectiveness. This lesson, written in the wreckage of bunkers across Eastern Europe and sealed in the classified after-action reports that analyzed what went wrong in Soviet strategic planning, remains as relevant today as it was in 1983. In an era of rapid technological change and asymmetric threats, the ability to question assumptions and imagine new possibilities is as important as firepower or force structure. The generals who cannot adapt, who cannot conceive of warfare evolving beyond their experience, are destined to repeat General Kulikov's mistake, laughing at threats they do not understand until those threats prove them catastrophically wrong.